Hello, my name is Rachel Ricápito, and I'm a proud pastor's wife. My husband and I are located at the Nuevos Comienzos Church of the Nazarene in Carbondale, Illinois. Today I would just like to talk a little bit about learning from cultures. And my hope in this workshop is that you would understand how to identify what a culture is and be more equipped to handle multicultural ministry experiences, as well as be able to prepare yourself or others for what is called culture shock. So I just wanted to start with what I learned while I was in college, which is the 5 pillars of culture. I feel like a lot of times people identify culture in a way that isn't necessarily accurate. And this helped me while I was in college to understand a little bit more from where I was coming from, as well as when I had experiences outside of the United States. To give you a little bit more of background about myself before I get into the 5 pillars of culture. I was raised in Michigan, and I studied intercultural studies at Olivet Nazarene University. And I also studied abroad in Ecuador Spanish. And so I've always had a very huge interest in cultures, specifically Hispanic culture. So everything I speak about today is going to be taken from my own personal experiences, but also the materials I cover can be applied to any type of culture. And actually, I met my husband, who's from Argentina, in Ecuador. We both were part of a Nazarene program of planting a church, but we did our training in Ecuador, and then we went to Argentina for about 2.5 years with other members of our group to start a church plant there. So in a nutshell, that's my background, to give you a little bit more of an idea of where I'm coming from, to give you some of this information. So to continue, what culture really is and how it impacts your life, because each one of us comes from a certain culture, and this helped me while I was studying it to really understand other people as well as my own culture. So when we think about pillars hold something up, and each pillar is the same height as the other, or else the thing it's holding up will fall over. So with that in mind, each one of these pillars is extremely important. One is not more important than the other, and it encompasses what culture is. So the very first one, again, no specific order, is language. If a culture does not have a language, then it's not a culture. You have to have language. It is a structure within the culture to start relationships, to communicate with one another is an essential thing to encompass culture. Whether it's with your family, friends, your community, there has to be some sort of way in which we communicate together, and that is language. Now, because there are different cultures that share the same language, that doesn't mean they're the same culture. For example, English is spoken in many different countries in the world, and so is Spanish. But that doesn't make those individual countries the same culture. Why is that? Because there's 4 other pillars in culture that make those different countries unique to one another, and I'm going to get into those. The second pillar is customs and traditions. I put those together. I suppose that you could divide them into 2 separate pillars, but I put them together because they're very, very similar and walk hand in hand. Customs would be something like how you greet somebody. For example, my husband is from Argentina, as I've already mentioned, and there when you greet somebody, it doesn't matter if it's for the first time or for the 100th time. They kiss each other on the cheek. It doesn't matter if you're male, female, it doesn't matter who you are. That is the way they greet each other. And me, as an American, I'm used to handshaking. That's the way we greet, generally speaking. So seeing that was a little bit different for me, and again, a cultural difference. Traditions would be more in the realm of what we would do as a culture, maybe a yearly basis, even monthly basis. A good idea or a good example of that off the top of my head, just from recent events that have happened in my culture, American culture, is Christmas. Christmas in the United States is usually revolved around the birth of Christ, and we also, a lot of families incorporate Santa Claus in that. So those are different traditions that the United States has around Christmas. Even within Christmas, there's traditions, baking cookies, all different types of things. Another example of a tradition held by a certain culture is called a quinceañera. Quinceañeras are basically a coming of age party for a 15-year-old girl, typically in some Hispanic culture. I know it to be true in Mexican culture and Argentine culture. Both practice quinceañeras. I'm sure there are more than that, but those are the ones I know for sure. So growing up, I didn't have a quinceañera because I was born in the United States, and that wasn't part of my culture. That doesn't mean that there isn't quinceañeras in the United States, but I guarantee you if you see one, they're probably going to have a Mexican background or Argentine background or something like that. That's why they celebrate quinceañeras. So moving on, those are examples for customs and traditions. So the third pillar is food. And when I was studying this in college, I thought, food? How is food a pillar of tradition, or of culture, excuse me? But then I started thinking about it, and I realized that food is almost in every single thing we do as a society. Think about it. Any type of festivity, Christmas dinner, potlucks at church. I mean, there's so many different things that incorporate food into your culture. There's also different types of customs that involve food, different ways you're supposed to eat or not eat. And not to mention, there are all different types of food. If you go to China, you're going to have different food than if you were to go to the Philippines. There's just so many different varieties of food. Just to give you some ideas, Mexican tamale as opposed to the Guatemalan tamale, they're very different. You may have no idea, but they are very different from each other, even though they share a similar name. An Argentine asado, which is basically like a huge barbecue in Argentina, and that is heavily laced with customs, that whole entire practice. American hamburger. There's so many different ones, and if you think about your grandma's secret recipe, there's just so many different ways in which to eat and partake in meals together that are the base of cultures. Continuing, the fourth pillar, and if I had to pick one that's the most important, but again, they're all equally important, is family. Why is family so important? I'm going to even get more specific. Parents or your caregiver are considered your first teacher in this life. So think about it. Your parents or your sisters, brothers, whoever's taking care of you, are the ones that teach you about the world. They give you your world view. They are the ones that give you your identity. They are the ones that shape you in the way that you should grow up. And they also show you the norms of your culture. So it is extremely important. Family is extremely important to cultures. And piggybacking on family leads me into the fifth pillar, which is religion. Why do I say piggybacking on that one? Because typically speaking, if your family, just use an example, is a Catholic family, you're probably going to identify with Catholicism when you're older. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll practice it, but if somebody were to ask you, what religion are you? You'll probably say, I'm a Catholic. Obviously, there's exceptions to this. There are people that go through conversion stories. There are people that were raised Muslim and they convert to Christianity. And many examples of that. So there obviously are exceptions to that. But generally speaking, each culture has a way of worshiping, has an idea of a higher being, a higher power, whether that is they pray to the true God or whether they pray to Buddha, whatever it might be. There is a base of religion in each culture. So I hope that kind of helped you kind of understand a little bit better what culture is, and it helped me when I learned that to examine my own culture, where I come from, what practices I do, what customs I am part of. Okay, so that leads me into the other topic I wanted to talk about, which is culture shock. If you've ever studied any type of cultural studies, you will have come across this topic. And if you've ever went to a foreign country before for any period of time, probably more than 2 weeks, you may have even experienced culture shock. And I personally can say that I have on multiple occasions. And because of that, I wanted to be able to articulate it very well so that you will understand what exactly it is. So the Collins Dictionary says it this way: a state of bewilderment and distress experienced by an individual who is suddenly exposed to a new, strange, or foreign social and cultural environment. the alienation, confusion, surprise that may be experienced by someone encountering unfamiliar surroundings, a strange city, community, or a different culture. So even within that definition, culture shock can happen within your own culture. I've experienced it. Raised in Michigan, I moved down to Southern Illinois. There were things that happened here that I wasn't used to, and vice versa. There are things that I do that I know that people here are like, oh, that's a little strange, that weird Michigander. No, but there are differences even with regions of the same culture. So what exactly does that look like then? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 5 stages of grief. Now, I want to be very clear. Culture shock is not grief, but the way that they structure the 5 stages of grief is a good way to understand a little bit better what culture shock is. So I'm going to talk about the 5 stages of culture shock. After you've been in a culture for, let's just say, a couple weeks, and you've experienced, it was so much fun trying all these different foods, you're in the honeymoon stage. It's exciting, it's new, you love it, or you think you do. But then let's say you're planning on being in that same culture for at least 3 months or more. So after the honeymoon phase, you go into what's called the denial and isolation. Now, obviously, those words are a little bit strong, but bear with me a little bit. That's when you start to, your mind starts to understand, oh, I'm going to be here for a while. I don't know if I'm okay with that. So then your emotions start to kind of reject it. And you automatically start having thoughts like, oh, this isn't happening. Oh, I'm not going to be here that long. Oh, it won't be that bad. Those are signs that you're kind of in a denial. You're kind of like, oh, no, I'm not going to really worry about this yet. And some people go even farther and go through what's called an isolation. I didn't do that. I know people have. I know people have literally gone away. Whether that means they go in the room for a few hours to kind of just process by themselves, or whether that means they kind of, stand apart from the culture in some way. They isolate themselves to kind of emotionally protect themselves, if that makes any sense. And then the second stage would be anger. Again, kind of a strong word, but it could be just frustration. You kind of know you're going through that phase if you hear yourself saying something like, well, in my country, we do it this way. Or you could hear yourself saying, that's silly, different, interesting, whatever word you want to say, that you guys do it that way. So what does that mean? You're kind of differentiating yourself from the new culture. And if you hear somebody else say that, you're going to be like, okay, I think they're going through some culture shock. Why? Because they're not used to that. They're acknowledging that something is different than what they're used to. And they may not necessarily say it negatively. They may just be making an observation. So it's not always negative, but it can be in the culture shock stage. So just bear that in mind. If you hear yourself saying that or somebody else saying that, give them some grace or give yourself some grace because you might be going through culture shock. Third is bargaining. That's when you start assimilating yourself. That's when you're like, okay, I'm okay. I think I'm okay with this, but you're still kind of like arm's length away from it. So an example that I had with this would be, let's say you're eating a meal, a lunch in this new culture, and everything on your plate seems a little bit different. You're not used to it. But let's say there's also rice on your plate. Okay, rice isn't that strange to me. I'm going to add ketchup to it. I don't know how many people eat ketchup with their rice with ketchup, but I know some. And in some respects, what you're doing there is bargaining. You're making something foreign to you be a little bit more familiar by adding something from your old culture to it. And it doesn't always have to be with food. It can be in a lot of different scenarios, but you might not even consciously think that through. You might simply just be, oh, I would just like to have ketchup with this. That's possible, but it also could be you're going through a stage of culture shock. Fourth is probably the strongest one, which would be depression or a form of sadness. This is when you really realize I'm in this and I'm not getting out anytime soon. And unfortunately, some people really have a hard time with it. Some people don't go through the stage much at all. So it really just depends on the person. But in this situation, you often seek comfort. An example of that personally, when I was studying in Ecuador to do the church plant, I was the only American there for a pretty big span of time. Not all of our teammates had arrived yet. So there was Argentines, there was Ecuadorians, there was Colombians, there was all different types of cultures, but I was really the only American there for a little while. So I felt kind of isolated from my culture. And then I heard that some American girl had arrived on the seminary where we were at, and she wasn't part of our team, but I was excited. I was so excited to know that there was another American that could speak English with me. I didn't have to speak Spanish anymore. I could speak English. So I immediately asked where she was at. I went down, introduced myself, and I wouldn't normally have done that, but I ended up becoming really good friends with her. I speak to her till this day. But that was, in a way, how I was coping with the new culture. I was really missing my home culture, so I sought something out that was very familiar. The fifth and final stage is acceptance. Now, that's exactly what it sounds like. This is when you finally realize, okay, I'm in it, I'm okay with it, I feel okay, I'm normal, I'm accepting it. These are different things for me, but you know what, it's okay, and I'm going to be okay with it. And that doesn't necessarily mean you'll go back to the honeymoon stage. I suppose it could mean that, but it just means you're at a good spot. You've normalized everything. You're okay mentally, and you're set. So in some respects, I like to think of it this way. If you analyzed your own culture, you would find things that you don't really like about your own culture. So that's kind of how what you would be in the acceptance stage. You might not go back to the honeymoon stage because there's still things you don't necessarily like about that culture, but you're still okay with it. You're accepting it. You've assimilated. So those are the 5 stages of culture. Culture shock. And I've definitely dealt with that. And there's something also called reverse culture shock, which means when you come home, you experience all these things again, and sometimes even stronger. And that was the case with me. I actually had worse reverse culture shock than culture shock. So why am I giving you all this information? Well, to really understand differences and likenesses, I guess, in culture. We need to understand what culture is, and we need to understand how we respond to different cultures. And if you are feeling that the Lord is calling you to start a multicultural or some sort of different culture than your own ministry, this will be helpful to you. Because even though what I just mentioned to you is typically happens when you go to a different culture, it still can happen here. And I'm going to use myself as an example. Again, I married somebody from a different culture. He's from Argentina. He speaks Spanish as his first language. So we speak Spanish in our house. And at the church, at this same thing, speak Spanish. It's very much so not what I was used to growing up. I was used to going to an English-speaking church. I was used to the customs and the norms of an English-speaking church. In our church right now, we have 5 different cultures represented. We have Argentine, American, Guatemalan, Honduran, and Mexican, all present in our church. The Guatemalan culture is the most predominant, and why do I say that? Because there's just literally more Guatemalans, and so their culture tends to be the strongest in the church. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with it. But you can experience moments of what I was just talking about, even in your own backyard, so to speak. And how do you handle that? How are you supposed to go into ministry that way? The best way I can say to anybody who has a desire to go into some sort of multicultural ministry, and I think this is true in any ministry, you have to remember that even though you felt called to go into that ministry, you have to remember, how can I serve these people? How can I be a servant to the people that I'm going to be ministering to? That's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus served his disciples. So if we go at it at the angle of, I'm going to learn a lot, even though I want to teach, I want to help these people, I want to minister unto them, they're going to minister unto you. You're going to learn so much, especially if it is a cross-cultural ministry. So one little tip that I've learned through the years of being involved in many different cultures is those moments when you sense, okay, there might be something here that I'm not understanding fully. There might be something cultural here that I'm not fully grasping. When you recognize that, especially in the moment, that's the best. If you can recognize it in the actual moment it's happening, try to apply these steps, and these have helped me so much over the years if I remember to do them. Once you recognize it, just stop whatever you're doing, whether that means you're walking, mid-sentence, whatever you're doing, just pause for a second, take a minute, And then almost simultaneously, just start processing the moment. Try to think it through. Okay, what's going on here? Why do I sense that there's something strange? Identify what it is that's strange or different or interesting, whatever the word is you want to use. And then 3, ask. Now, this doesn't always present itself, but if you can ask somebody for more information or honestly seek some information to help you understand, do it. Not all the situations present itself that way, but remember to ask somebody later. If you can't ask in the moment, ask somebody later about it. Another example of this, I was one time talking to one of our parishioners in our church who's not from here. She's from a different country, and she was talking a lot about her family and a lot about her grandparents, and she was emphasizing so much the importance of her grandparents and her grandmother specifically, but she was talking about it in such a way that it seemed like it was cultural. And not that we don't appreciate our grandparents, but I could just tell that it was very important. And so I kind of started processing that, and I realized this might be something cultural. I should probably learn a little bit more about what she's talking about. So I took the moment to say, hey, I've noticed that you've been talking a lot about grandparents, specifically your grandmother. And I just am curious and honest. I really want to know, do you guys do something special for your grandparents? Are they held in high esteem in your culture? What do you guys do to celebrate your grandparents? I was truly trying to understand where she was coming from. And because I came at it at the angle of I want to be taught, she was very happy to oblige me. She filled me in, she helped me out, I understood so much more. And then the 4th and final step would be what? Apply that information. So now that I know that about her culture, I'm gonna log that away and realize, okay, so if something else comes up later, I'm gonna remember what she said. So that way, it will help me next time. It won't be so uncomfortable. And my scenario was actually not uncomfortable at all. It was just more of like, oh, this is interesting. But there are scenarios where it is uncomfortable, where you feel like, oh, I did something wrong, or I'm not sure what's going on here, or I totally said something wrong. In those situations, again, if you can't ask, have somebody in mind that you know you could go to ask. For example, my husband, I can ask him whatever I want to ask him about culture because I know that he's going to love me and help me to understand. So find somebody like that you can depend on that is able to help you in those culturally awkward moments if you can't figure out what you need to understand in that moment. If you're following along in the PDF available, you will be seeing a diagram that is from this book. And it just talks about ways in which to deal with culture and different attitudes going into different cultures. And what I'm talking about today is just kind of like the surface level of a lot of topics. So I highly recommend, if you're planning on going in any type of ministry or just going abroad, I don't know, studying abroad or being involved in any type of culture that is foreign to yours, I highly recommend reading this book. It is so helpful. It talks a lot about what I've already touched on today in a much deeper way. So it's called Cross-Cultural Connections by Dwayne Miller, and it's in the PDF as well, the information. So check that book out. And then continuing, in those situations that, again, you feel uncomfortable or you're not really sure, okay, what should I do? What should I not do? Just remember to give the other person the benefit of the doubt. What does that mean? We all need more grace. Give them grace. Don't assume what they're trying to do to you or not do. A lot of times we might, because we're uncomfortable or because the person reacted in such a way, we might think they're mad at us or they're trying to embarrass us or whatever it might be. That's actually probably not the case in probably 99% of the situations. They are not trying to make you uncomfortable. They probably feel just as uncomfortable, actually. And a lot of times in those socially awkward moments or culturally awkward moments, a lot of times the other person's trying to teach you something. They're not trying to humiliate you. So be open to being taught. It's very easy to jump to the conclusion that everyone's attacking you. And that's the worst way of handling that situation. If nothing else, just keep quiet, observe, try to understand. And this is true in general, not just with cultures. I think in general we should always try to give the other person the benefit of the doubt and not be quick to judge what's going on. And always, always, always seek out information as much as you can. And so to wrap things up, why is this all important? In 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23, I'm not going to read it. It is available on the PDF. If not, I recommend you looking it up. This is where Paul talks about being, for example, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Now, obviously, he's talking spiritually. The Lord used him, of course, to write this spiritually, in a spiritual aspect. But I also believe that Paul was talking culturally here. Think about it. If there was somebody in the Bible that understood differences in culture, it would have been Paul. Paul was an amazing missionary, the first missionary of the church, and he understood what it meant to going into new areas and dealing with people that aren't from his culture. And so when it says, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews, it's not meaning that he became a Jew in the sense that he's a non-believer in Christ anymore. That's not what that means. It means that he understood where they were coming from. He engaged, he assimilated into their culture so that he would be able to connect with them, so that he would be able to have a relationship with them and then introduce the gospel to them. And that means in any culture. Now, be careful. Again, that does not mean, okay, in order to win some Muslims to Christ, I'm going to become a Muslim and pray to Allah so that way I can win people to Christ. That doesn't even make logical sense. What it means is that you are going to engage in their culture. You're going to meet them where they're at. You're going to love them. You're going to understand them. You are going to ask questions and engage with them. So that way you can build a relationship and you can understand where they're coming from and introduce the gospel to them to save them through Christ. So I think that's something we need to remember when we read this passage. It is so rich in talking about that. It is obviously talking spiritual, but it's also talking very much so culturally. And then finally, why does this all matter? Because Jesus tells us that we need to go and make disciples in the Great Commission. Matthew 28:18 through 20. Again, I encourage you to look it up. That is our final call. That is our ultimate call on this earth, is to go and make disciples, to share the gospel one with another. And that looks like so many different things to so many different people. That definitely might mean staying in your own backyard and just talking to your neighbor about Christ. But it also might mean interculturally. It might mean that you have to learn another language and go to another country and talk to people about Christ. It might mean you have to learn another language and stay where you're at and help people that are from different countries. And that's the other thing I was going to emphasize, is that people, when you start intercultural ministries here in the United States, you have to remember the people that you're coming in contact with, they're not from here. They feel foreign. They're probably going through culture shock. They're probably having moments of just, I don't know what to do, anxiety. Remember that you are trying to love them and be their comfort. So be willing to understand their side of it and what they're coming from. So just remember what Christ tells us to do. We need to go and make disciples. And I hope that this workshop was able to give you a little bit of help when you have to engage in different cultures. And if you have any questions, my email address is in the PDF, and I have some sources written down there. I've already mentioned one. Another great source is, I recommend everybody to go look up The Pineapple Story by Otto Koning on YouTube. It's a Dutch missionary that went to Guinea, I believe, New Guinea. And it's just riddled with funny stories, but also just with different cultural differences and how he figured them out, if you will. So hopefully this was helpful to you. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you so much.